Hello, and welcome to Avasant's Digital Forum, Governance Reimagined, Enabling Business Agility and the Digital Enterprise. My name is Andriana Albert, and I will be your MC today. Avasant is thrilled to be able to offer our attendees an hour of thought leadership and expert insights from two innovative organizations, CEMEX and ATB Financial. Thank you for joining us. As we aim to ensure that these sessions are as interactive as possible, we encourage you to utilize the Q&A and chat features on your dashboard to ask questions of the panelists. They will be answering them live throughout the session. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, Carlos Hernandez. Carlos is a vendor governance thought leader, partner, and digital transformation global lead at Avasant. Carlos, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Adriana, and good morning, everyone. Good evening for some of you. It is a pleasure to have everybody here today to talk about transformational governance and how governance is changing and being reimaged to be able to operate effectively in the digital enterprise. We have a very interesting session today. We have great panelists that are very experienced and thought leaders in the space. And we're going to talk about for the most part around three different topics. One, how the complex technology and services landscape requires a next generation approach for governance, especially with everything changing today with COVID and the rapid acceleration of digitalization across the enterprises. We're going to talk about some of the key factors that are accelerating the need for new governance methods to support a digital enterprise. And also, how do we improve sourcing outcomes through automated analytics enable governance, which is now how enterprises are measuring things with different vendors and ecosystem. So we have a lot of good interesting things to talk about. We have prepared some questions that we're going to share with the panelists, and we're going to make this session very interactive and hope we can have some good questions from the audience. So again, as we think about what is happening, and I have 2 or 3 slides that I'm going to kind of go through to use as context before we get into the conversations with Michael and Josue, which I'm gonna very quickly introduce them. Josue is the head of vendor management at CEMEX, very experienced, very thought leader executive in the organization, and definitely a thought leader. And Michael Prazumak, which is the managing director of vendor oversight at ATB Financial. Michael, as well, is very experienced, over 25 years of experience in managing vendors across different enterprises, and definitely a thought leader. I have had the pleasure to work with both of them in different capacities, and they are both clients of ours. And so, it's going to be quite great to see their different perspectives that the organizations are in not only in different industries, but also in different levels of maturity and progression through the evolution of the next generation of vendor management. So I want to welcome both of them and thank you for participating. So before we get into the slides, I think that as a backdrop of the conversation, it is important to, as we all know how everything is changing during COVID, that in the era of digital transformation, all the different vendor relationships have become a lot more complex than they used to be in the past. There is incredibly rapid adoption of digital technologies, flexible contracts, and platform-based services that are just really forcing us one way or another to change our global delivery models and how the IT organizations are working with different vendors, systems integrators, and some of the peers alike. So that is creating a tremendous amount of change and is being accelerated with COVID. Also, because of all of this, and the accelerated way in which we are having to transform our vendor relationships and changing our strategic models, we are being now forced to take a look at how we are measuring things differently, how we are reporting things differently, and how we adopt and respond differently to how we deal with these relationships, since we can no longer be together in the same room and either negotiate contracts or resolve issues in the way that we probably used to in the past. And again, because of COVID and the accelerated digitalization, we are really seeing a great demand for transparency, business continuity assurance, and contingency management with all our vendors, especially being remote and having higher expectations from delivery and thought leadership and driving innovation, this becomes absolutely critical. So why don't we go into the first slide real quick, Adriana, if you don't mind. So when we think about, the progression of how governance has been transforming and how technology has become, incredibly important as part of this process. If you guys remember in the 90s, when we all had the first generation, outsourcing models, it was for the most part, single source, the first generation, just, one large vendor under all multiple towers across IT and basically driving the overall sourcing strategy and IT strategy of organizations. And we still see a couple of situations or a few situations, the same way. But then we began to evolve in the 2000s at a more cost-driven governance. We began dealing with 9/11 and how cost cutting became very important for most organizations and how we drove that governance with different vendors to achieve those objectives. Then around 2010, we began looking at more of a technology, converged technologies now being in place and across different organizations. So we move into a more platform-based governance. To now, in 2020, even with COVID, transformational governance and the digital era has now even changing things, quite a bit more, because now, we look at all the standards of transformational governance, everything is just based on a cloud-first architecture. Digitalization, especially now as we have moved, where everything is moving to the cloud very rapidly, it's become pretty much a standard to have a cloud-first architecture. Also optimize processes for the digital multi-vendor governance. It's just not looking at the traditional multi-vendor environment operating in the way that we knew how, but now it's all digitalized with different players across the ecosystem. AI and automation-based analytics across integrated systems, very critical, as now all decisions are data-driven. Most of our executives, most of our clients, and even vendors alike are making their decisions based on data. So data-driven decision-making is now how executives are, operating today. And business-driven real-time KPIs and SLAs, I think that we have known that for a while, but the need of having now analytics and different technologies, connected technologies and platforms together to provide that information and analyze and report it has become very critical. So we are seeing the evolution and the journey of transformational governance across different companies. And today when we hear from Michael and Josue on how are things working and how are they envisioning and going through this transformation and progressing across the maturity model and the organization, we'll see some of that. But again, if we go to the next slide, the most common governance challenges that we are very aware of are the antiquated contracts. Antiquated contracts has just become a problem that is becoming even more critical now as a lot of vendors and organizations are trying to reimagine themselves and go into transformation and really using COVID in a way as an excuse to reshape a lot of the contract. And I think that in the past, the focus on service delivery was just really driven for the most part based on technology elements as opposed to business outcomes. Milestones and deliverables were limited to service transition, not built out of new capabilities. So all of those things are just enabling now creating shorter contracts, working with agile procurement and some other mechanisms that enable applied innovation, the acceleration of digitalization to take place rapidly. Irrelevant metrics, I think that this is a kind of a blast from the past, but it's becoming even more relevant now as traditional IT SLAs and milestones are losing relevancy. Nobody cares about those much anymore because it's all now business value driven and focusing on business outcomes. So those metrics, as we know, have not been aligned properly with business capabilities or business outcome and not even aligned with business expectations. As especially now as all the historical views and all the different trends that a lot of organizations and vendors alike used to deal with have gone away, because with COVID, looking at trends and how the business used to behave, how things used to be reported are really no longer relevant. Everybody has had to reinvent themselves in the way that things are being measured. And operational maturity, organizational maturity, I think that, as the vendor management function and the vendor governance evolves and becomes more strategic, the size and technology being used has also changed, right? And the level of maturity becomes really interesting. And, again, this is part of the conversation that we are going to have here shortly on how each of the organizations at CEMEX and ATB are maturing and using technology and adapting to the business changes and service delivery model changes that the organizations are going through. And looking at, complex ecosystem of partnerships. I think that, in the past, it was, as we look in the previous slide, it was just, one large vendor dealing with most of the elements of IT and managing the organization, all together. Now we have niche vendors, we have even systems integrators, and we have all kinds of digital companies now delivering very strategic services to their clients. So managing that ecosystem of partnerships that is extremely complex becomes, interesting and even more relevant than ever. That's why, there's a need to have the categorization of the vendors, understanding which one the strategic vendors, which necessarily doesn't have to mean that are the largest vendors with a client. So how do we manage that becomes critical as well. And ultimately looking at the delivery focus, missing the technology architecture. Again, it was just not looking at managing delivery, managing the services, but not really looking at technology and architecture. So then when we go into the next slide, what is driving that transformation and those changes very rapidly, I think that then is when we really begin to see the evolving client behavior and how our clients are now expecting results very quickly. In less than 6 months, they're expecting innovation to be able to be visible and measurable a lot faster, everything as a service. And the scope now including all branches of technology, architecture, and security models that we didn't used to see in the past, all driven with co-investment with the vendors and driving zero-cost transformation and gain sharing models. Analytics and decisions, as mentioned before, everything now is based on data analytics, AI, and the ability to be able to share that kind of information at different levels, stakeholder groups, to understand where we are in the business, how we are making progress with our digital transformation efforts, and driving innovation in our organization. New spread of suppliers, I think we just talked about this before. It's now based on micro vendors, integrated vendors with other subs that are delivering particular services in different industries. And then there are really transformational agents, just not service delivery technology vendors, but transformational partners within the organization. Value optimization, I think that it is all about, driving innovation, collaboration, being part of the overall revenue growth of the organizations and driving the customer experience to a different level, all driven by agility and speed to market. And increased risk and regulatory compliance, I think that's become, more important and interesting with COVID, as now there is a need and a lot more measure to be able to have that compliance that is needed in the marketplace. Focus on business outcomes. We've talked about this already, and the need to have the different type of metrics, speed to result, time to correction, speed to respond, all of those things that are now critical for organization and the accelerated demand for digital transformation. So I think that this is now some of the key elements that we are talking about, especially now when when looking at a lot of different organizations, about 72% plan to maintain or increase the participation of vendors as part of their ecosystem. About 83% want to increase that portion of how they're working with the vendors, with services being delivered near shore or offshore. So again, traditional governance is has not been driving the alignment to the desired business outcomes, and part of the discussion here today is how we are seeing organizations change that now. And as we look at with Josue and Michael, We want to talk about how they're doing things in their own organization, and those are going to be part of the questions that we're gonna talk about. Andriana.
Thanks, Carlos. Now I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed panelists. We would love to just give each of you a minute to do a quick introduction. Josue, let's start with you.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Jose Rodriguez with CEMEX. When we created BMO back in 2012, this area was created to manage strategic sourcing relationships, in charge of achieving savings and cost reductions, and also service quality. I have IT background, and I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful, thank you. Hi, Michael, welcome.
And good morning. Hi, everyone. Michael Premizak, and very thankful to be here and much appreciate the opportunity. I've had the pleasure of working in the technology and the procurement space for over 25 years, and I've also worked very, very closely with the technology vendors that I manage very closely at ATB. So I've had the pleasure of working with SAP and the Oracles of the world, the big boys, Microsoft. It's been a lot of fun. And I'm very happy to actually give some lessons learned in how we actually manage vendors based on actually being on the vendor side of the equation.
Wonderful, thank you, welcome. Carlos, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Andriana. So, as mentioned before, both of you are in different situations, different industries, different models and level of maturity in your vendor management function. So we're going to have a very interesting discussion ahead of us as we enable business agility and digital enterprise. So I think that what I would like to start by with a more kind of an introductory question that I want both of you to give us your perspective in terms of how are you evolving your vendor management processes or the simplified processes, capability, maturity, and impact, improved engagement with the business now, given the rapid adoption of digital technologies, flexible contracts, and platform-based services that together has changed our traditional delivery models and partnerships with different vendors. Michael, you want to start first?
Sure. Nice long question there, Carlos. Much appreciated, but all good.
Well, you know me.
I know. So yeah, I think one of the big things that is very neat in terms of vendor management evolution is just the impact of senior leadership in terms of recognizing the importance of vendor oversight capabilities in an organization and how that extends down into the relationships that play. So when you look at the evolution in this comes from direct leadership at the organizational level. Chief technology officers, senior vice presidents now have a strong interest. So when I look at the evolution of the vendor management function, it is truly getting much better in the space of the relationship management and understanding your vendors. One of the biggest opportunities that I see in terms of evolving it is to extend that understanding by understanding how your vendors are to be segmented. And this is a very different stream than a traditional procurement category management perspective. You can look at vendors a lot of different ways, but one of the most important things is you look at it from your organization's perspective. What's important to you? In our organization, we do look at our strategic vendors. We look at emerging vendors. We look at tactical and commodity vendors. We define them and we actually group accordingly. We understand the spend in those segments, and then we realize that those segments, the vendors in those segments, cross multiple procurement categories. So it's not an easy traditional procurement thing. So that's one of the big evolutions that happen. The other thing that we do that's a little bit different is we really align to innovation. Again, on the vendor relationship side of the equation, we have singled out vendors in a specific segment that bring innovation to the table, want to bring innovation to the table, and we give them the opportunity to interact with us through our normal governance processes. So I see significant evolution in that regard. And I look at governance as well. One of the big themes of this session is governance now to us is no longer painted with just a single brush, but rather we attach the governance to the segments we defined. So when we look at how we treat a strategic vendor that we spend a lot of money on, it's very different than a small vendor. It's very different from an emerging vendor. And those differences give you an opportunity to develop stronger relationships over the long term. And I think the very last thing that we do is we're stitched right into the business. Leadership has a very strong integrated view of how this needs to be done. I have to be stitched into information technology leadership, procurement, finance. If you have a distinct accounts payable function, we need to be connected with all these players, because at the end of the day, as we continue to evolve this space, the big stakeholder in this is going to be risk, third-party risk management organizations. I've been very pleased with all of our stakeholders. They've been pretty warm and receptive in terms of working together. But as we've evolved our capabilities, those are my thoughts on how to grow and to really take vendor management to another level altogether.
Thanks, Michael. What about you, Josue? And from your perspective, given a little bit of a different model that you have at CEMEX?
Yes. In our case, it's important to say when we started BMO, we inherited a simplified vendor ecosystem, because at that time, CEMEX was running 12 years of consolidation and standardizations. So the BMO took over a relationship of 200 suppliers, out of which 10% are strategic, right? With the focus of a strategic sourcing relationship, we created a model. Actually, this model was based on ITIL processes, and with one focus to pursue excellence in managing the relationship. We managed to achieve somewhere between level 2 and level 3 of maturity. You know, perhaps when you are in level 2, you have something repeatable. When you're in stage 3, you start to be proactive. So we are there, but it's not enough, right? So as per our pursuit to excellence, we are aiming to jump to a stage 4, in which we are able to start to not only react and support the decision-making process of the selection, but also support the businesses in the journey, in that transformation. There are two specific aspects that concerns us, and we are looking forward to improve. The first is this balance between speed and compliance, because as you were commenting, the business is demanding to do things quick, but also the context, the environment is demanding us to reinforce compliance. And for us, that is the challenge, how to achieve that balance. The two specific domains we are looking for is to rethink our contract structure. Because of the type of contracts we have, they tend to be big, complex. So we are aiming to achieve a modular focus, so we can have the flexibility to couple and decouple services easily in these long-term relationships, and also how to rethink the governance and the performance model, because we need to delegate decision-making. We need to involve a lot of people along the chain, more than we do now. But at the same time, in order to cover the compliance aspect, we need to have controls enforced with digital platforms. This along the performance and the governance model. So from our standpoint, I will say that these are the two specific domains that we are looking forward to improve over the next few months.
Right. This is very good, and you know, I want to talk about the you know, how as you are progressing, you measure and now link those results with working with the vendors to business outcomes. But based on what both of you said, and Michael, you were talking about, you know, how you're working with differently with different vendors according to the segmentation, and Jose, when you were talking about, you know, in a way that you're managing the vendors and how you are having to make those changes to be able to measure the right thing. But one of the things that I think that I heard from you guys and in a way is that there is a lot more influence on the business and a lot more knowledge in the business and the participation on how these relationships are being managed. So that is, you know, as you know, there is, you know, different theories about, you know, vendor management being a centralized function and an enterprise function to do this and that, but to be able to have compliance and be able to have that structure and discipline. However, there is a trend now that is called the business-led IT, which is business managing vendors themselves. We've heard that for a long time, but now there is a lot more knowledge. There is a lot more technology interaction, and with everything with cloud services, low-code capabilities, and analytics, that is accelerating this. How are you dealing with now the more mature business stakeholders that are kind of forcing their way into, well, we can also do this ourselves, but because we have the relationships and we're driving the business, we are faster to be able to drive innovation. So how are you be able to keep that compliance way and be able to still establish that structure so that things don't get out of control?
I think, and it's important to emphasize, CEMEX has always looked for having one single CEMEX. And that means, for instance, digital transformation in CEMEX is being led by one member of the executive committee. And this executive committee member is in charge of digital transformation in two pillars. One is on the business side. He has a team that engage with the business in order to identify the needs. And also the IT side, which is the technology, right? So in our case, that simplifies a lot because all the business areas, they do have the knowledge of their business for sure, but all transformation, engagement, and all the plan towards adopting digital are in alignment with this structure. So that helps a lot. That helps a lot. The challenge for sure is how to, we achieve the speed portion, right? Because this structure ensures the compliance. BMO, we have created strategic relationships with the people that is moving these two sides, so we can complement the contractual part, the performance part, the governance part. But the thing in here, that's a differentiator in our case, right? That we were able, because of the business and our mandate towards one single CEMEX, to simplify that.
Good. Michael, I think that, if you can give us a 60-second view from how it works at an ATB, which I believe it could be a little bit different.
It's a little bit different. We do have the stakeholder internal relationships set up similar to what Jose has indicated in terms of making sure we're in lockstep with the business. I think that we try to align to compliance by making sure that as the business is looking at sourcing software or technology solutions, that we actually have a process in place to be complementary to it, not be viewed as the enemy in this regard, but rather to be a partner in this regard. The way we look at it is we work closely with procurement in terms of getting the new contracts in place, which are different. We do look at the governance of those contracts quite seriously. So what we try to do is get ahead of the curve on this one so it doesn't end up in our lap, but rather it ends up as a desired outcome working with the business, because that's what it comes down to. It's a partnership to move this bus forward. Otherwise, it's just not going to move very well. And the good news is you can have compliance and you can still have innovation at the same time. That's where I think the vendor oversight function really enables the business. And as I made the comment before, we're stitched into technology roadmaps, business roadmaps, and are openly questioned. How do you support the following? And we can answer that question.
All right, understood. Now, both of your companies are going through accelerated transformation and supporting, you guys are supporting, highly visible digital transformation initiatives and innovation, which, in some cases might have some low level of readiness and a high time to deliver, which in the majority of cases is short. So how are you benchmarking your chance of success and understand the impact of rapid innovation on digital platforms as you guys work with the different vendors and measure things differently?
So in our world, our benchmarking in terms of working with our vendors is done a couple of ways. We do take advantage of some of the regulatory bodies that are out there, the government of Alberta types things. So from traditional focuses around pricing, we can actually leverage some preferred pricing that's already available to us. So we can use that as a benchmarking to see how we do as an organization, to see how we align to a pre-agreed deal with the government of Alberta and a select number of vendors. So that's one thing. We do actively engage organizations to help us with benchmarking as too, and we are looking at very complex negotiations, especially what's coming down the pipe. The big word that comes out of all this is we are trying to move to a very, very proactive model so we can really see what's coming down the pipe where we need to do this. Our runway for strategic negotiations with strategic vendors, whether they be technology or risk related, the runway to negotiate with them can be over a year. So we try very hard to avoid those condensed negotiation windows that do not allow us to successfully benchmark. So rather, we've created a methodology which is very comprehensive. We can see clearly, these are the 6 stages we want to work through when we're negotiating with an SAP, for example. And we do it. We actually do our backgrounds checks. We validate with the business what's going on. We get a negotiation strategy. We actually negotiate and update people with what's going on. We engage legal early so they know this is coming because they're a big partner as well. And we're developing all these capabilities with the intent to reduce the surprise factor, because there's nothing worse than a senior leader getting a purchase order on their desk for $10 million and they're going, what is this? So, but yeah, we do use benchmarking extensively to make sure we're getting cost and benefit.
Okay. Josue, what about in your case at CEMEX?
I fully agree with Michael on the need of creating very open communication channels with strategic leaders, right? That is critical in order for us to be fully engaged along the process since the inception towards the realization. That I think that's the most critical factor. As I was mentioning before, all the different areas of expertise that CEMEX has created to mobilize the different transformation, the challenge that we have is to engage with all these lines so we can be very involved along the process. They are the ones who initiate the first contact with suppliers. So this framework that we are going to create is going to give them the flexibility to do those contacts. And by the time an opportunity is going to be realized is when we enter in place with these processes that we have created in order to ensure the compliance aspect. And I think that's from the inside. And from the outside, definitely we need to have that opinion of an external advisor. We managed each 2 years to conduct a benchmark internally to our processes, to our metrics, to our functions, to our roles, not only with the BMO, but also with the other areas. As I was commenting before, CEMEX has one global area for IT and other global area for global business services. So these assessments are done in conjunction with them in order for us to identify opportunities along the chain. And the last assessment was done actually last December. And I think that helps a lot in order for you to identify where you are, to what extent you managed to get to that stage when you develop your plan and where you are going to go. So basically that's are the 2 inputs that we consider.
How much, how much participation does the VMO function has working closely with the business, identifying those critical elements and business outcome KPIs that then can be measured and managed by your function and then reported in business terms in a way that from the central function, from the business perspective, for example, that is driving innovation and transformation can be effective. What do you find working effectively and yielding the greatest impact from your perspective, from the outside into the business, from the vendor management perspective?
So one of the things that we do is we do still focus on the fundamentals because they're never going to go away. You still look at the important things around savings and identifying the different types of saving types. So again, back to your business strategy, back to your technology strategy. In my world, we like to actually develop capability to showcase how we're saving cash flow and saving money by actually aligning to those different elements. So that's a big part of the equation. We do actively take governance up a level now, whereas before governance was a discussion. Now we actually track the consumption of governance to our segments. So we want to know how many vendors underneath governance, what types of governance are associated with them, What kind of relationship management strategy do we have with our vendors? And the other thing that comes out of it is tracking the movement of our vendors as they move through our segments. When we see an emerging vendor actually has a technology or a capability, the whole idea of having him that's in that segment of ours is to be able to move them into the strategic segment and say, this company's got something that could be very beneficial to ATB. Let's treat them differently and give them the capability or the ability to succeed. So those are important things. The other things that fall out when you start looking at KPIs, and you're going to see that as we move to the micro vendor and the smaller vendor strategies, there are incentives that are there that go beyond initial cost savings. So we do track credits in a very different way, because those small, nimble companies can give you incentives in ways you've never imagined. They have partnerships with huge organizations like Google and IBM, for example, in the technology space, so they can get access to even more and have multipliers. So what we found is there's an opportunity to look at KPIs in that regard. And lastly, when you look at technology roadmaps, there is an incentive to move to new technology platforms and the journey to support that movement. And as we've discovered, moving to the cloud is a lot easier said than done. It takes time, it takes resources. So for us, we can work with our vendors to facilitate that transformation to the cloud. And we can also set realistic expectations with our leadership to say, here's how we've set up our contracts to facilitate that journey.
What about you, Josue, from your perspective at CEMEX?
It's going back to that one's CEMEX motto, the way we have organized internally, we have these process experts. They are closely engaged with the business. And they are leading the digital transformation from that end, right? Then they are in charge of identifying those KPIs that will have impact to the customer. Then we have the people in charge of technology per se. They have mainly either standards or rules or definitions in order to confirm that these proposals for transformation are in alignment with our standards. And they are the ones that spot when new technologies will be required. And they are the ones in charge of how they will transform the business KPIs into technical KPIs that will be implemented in technology. And then is the BMO. The BMO is in charge, once all these definitions are gathered, how we translate those definitions into the contract modules that we need to sign and commit to CEMEX. So that's how the framework has been designed since 8 years ago. The degree of automation and the degree of interactions, to what extent we have that transparency along the model, is where we are at stage 2, somewhere around 3, and we're aiming to take it to the next level, right, to the 4th. So in order to make this process fully transparent and to accelerate the speed of this process. So I think in our case, having that segregation of duties has helped us to get closer to the business, to attempt to have one common technology model under one compliance framework.
Right. Is that, I mean, where do you see the biggest challenge based on what you just said? Is that from the technology analytics perspective, or around the integration of all the different platforms and data exchange across the organization and with the vendors, which they have their own technology and their own platforms? And where do you find the main challenge? Because it looks like, you know, I mean, is that a technology issue or is that data governance issue? Where do you see the main challenge?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think there are two aspects to that. As for setting up the model, I think the main challenge is how to do that service mapping properly. You know, because you have 3 different entities, the business, the technical, and the vendor, and they will need to connect all the dots. I think that's the most complex challenge in that phase. Once you are in daily basis, once you have signed the contract and you are in operation state, the key challenge is how can you connect the front with the back? You know, the front, what the customer is consuming as a service, with the back, with what the supplier is providing. How can you connect this works, because even though we have fewer vendors, we do have several platforms. There are at least 5 different global platforms feeding our performance model. And yes, we have Tableau and we have all those tools that help you to provide dashboards and consolidate basis, but that is not enough, because you need to be able to provide measurement to that service mapping, to give that service mapping, to make that service mapping a live map, right? Not a postmortem map. So I think that's the critical challenge. And one of the key objectives that we have is how can we simplify this ecosystem of 5 different platforms? And I'm not talking about the platforms that we use to develop or the platforms that we use to serve the customers. I'm talking about the platforms we use to capture what the suppliers are doing and to capture all the services that we are contracting from them.
Right. It's basically identifying, it's basically being able to have a single source of truth that is a live platform that keeps that information in your fingertips, because that is, typically the challenge, not only having the live business maps, current, being live feeds, but also, being connected with the business KPIs and with all the different systems that are feeding into that mothership, that it integrates and organizes all the data to be able to properly do performance management, to properly do contract administration and contract management, managing the different elements of the relationship, and obviously handling all the financials. So that is, especially in a convoluted environment of lots of dispersed technologies, can become a challenge. And Michael, what about from your perspective, as ATB also has different platforms and finding the single source of truth to be able to have live data.
We do also have multiple platforms that make data a little bit of a challenge right now, but we are actively engaging in that discussion internally as to what systems do we need to move forward with. The active discussion is there are, as per Timothy's question to the panel, like what kind of systems are we using? We also have the Tableau toolkits. We've used some of the online toolkits for information, but we are having a discussion to say, what is the path forward for ATB in this space? Because we have multiple stakeholders, and because we've developed some very good relationships with risk, with finance, there's now a very concerted effort to say, is there a bigger solution out there that fits all of our needs? Because the big theme that comes out of this information is that source of the truth just doesn't have to be the source of the truth. It has to be a shared source of the truth. We have to make sure that TIRISK, TPRM, third-party risk, is looking at information on a vendor. It's the same stuff I'm looking at. It's the same stuff finance is looking at, because if something goes off the rails, we don't want to have a circular discussion and say we have 4 systems that are giving different numbers. So we are actively looking at those types of tools. And the question that came from Timothy, there are best of breed solutions out there that do fantastic jobs. I would just encourage you look at the enterprise systems as well and have an organizational discussion to say, is there a bigger fish in the sea we could look at? Could we leverage a strategic relationship? I've had the pleasure of working with point systems for all the different areas. I've had the pleasure of working with the big ones, SAP Ariba, Coupa, Ivalua as a few. The ERP systems will claim that they can do this as well. It's possible. I think what's important is you look at your requirements holistically, and then you can really figure out what is the strategy, because vendor management is very distinct from procurement. And it makes a difference how you define your requirements from that. And you want to be complementary and work together, but at the same time, the way we look at vendors might be a little bit different than how other stakeholders do.
Right. Now, speaking now with procurement and given the rapid and the acceleration of digital transformation efforts and applied innovation, procurement organization and even when we talk about, the business of IT, they are very quickly engaging with vendors and starting right away the execution of the different innovation and transformation initiatives now, which is what we're calling now what's called agile procurement. How are your organizations adjusting to that speed and fast cycles for agile procurement to be able to manage those vendors effectively, and without having to deal with issues, with the procurement issues and the different responsibilities within each function.
So I think that's actually a question that came out from Vishal as well. So I'll try to dovetail that in there. But for us, we do work in partnership with the procurement stream. And what we actually try to differentiate on from a discussion standpoint is we really focus on the vendor life cycle management side of the equation versus they may focus more on the procurement and the contract life cycle side of the equation. When you draw that line, there is some very distinct differences. We were then able to work with procurement and define some very strong processes that are shared. We've also then developed very shared information sets. So now we have access and they have access mutually to shared files. It helps us understand budget. It helps us understand RFPs, for example, coming down the pipe that we need to be aware of. We clearly identify who's taking lead in those areas now. So we know that procurement's running with this one. They're letting us know what's going on. Great. In this case, we're taking the lead. The one common thing that I see between the functions is that there's both teams are creating capabilities like subject matter expertise in the areas we manage. So for us, one other thing that we do is we actually manage our vendors in a portfolio structure as well. Even though they're segmented, I have three directors that are essentially portfolio leads. They have strategic vendors emerging in a mix of all of them in there. And that has been so beneficial with our procurement team because we were able to open our kimono, show them what we're working on. They know who's accountable, and it worked. And it's been mutual. They've been great as well, coming back at us.
Right. Josue, what about you from your perspective?
Well, in our case, procurement and BMO reports to the same vice president, which is the vice president of global supply. And procurement is in charge of managing where the majority of CEMEX spend is, which is because being a manufacturing company, this is on machinery, raw materials, spare parts. So procurement focuses that, and BMO focuses services for IT, GPS, and outsourcing. So I think that has helped us to interact with procurement in a way that we have a common framework, because from the compliance standpoint, we both follow the same controls. However, from the strategic management of vendors, we behave differently, right? Because we have that separation between the assets and the services.
Right. Now, I know we are getting close to time, and I wanna allow time for each of you to deliver your closing remarks. But the next question that I have, Josue, and I want to start with you here, is as you are in a different, as you are mature in your organization, as you have been going through a lot of the changes, what in your perspective is the main element here that is basically enabling you to go from, let's say, from level 2 to level 4 in the overall digital governance maturity model, right? What would be those key elements that would enable you to get that level of maturity in respective to other companies, and for you to be able to handle the rapid business innovation that CEMEX is going through right now?
Yes. As I was commenting, given the fact of this segregation of duties, right, the relationship with the business, the technology definition, and the vendor definition, for me, moving to the next stage is to successfully digitize all the interaction along the channel. So it's clear for everybody to know where we are in the process. And it's clear for everybody to know where is the bottleneck. And it's clear for us and easy for us to deploy changes in the framework quickly. So I think that's one element. And the other element, to successfully implement that service mapping. That service mapping that we define with the support of these 3 towers, how can we successfully implement in a way that we can show how the front is connected with the back, how the customer that is receiving something, it can be either internal or external customer, how this customer is being affected by an action, an activity, a transaction, a deliverable that is conducted by a supplier. I think these are the two key elements that we have identified so far as the next step in our stage maturity.
Is there an element in terms of, the number of people that a vendor management function should have, or how technology and innovation is applied to be able to accelerate the outcomes and the value to the business, to be able to really report effectively on those business value metrics? Okay.
I think as for the number of people, I think that is a result of, to what extent we manage to digitize all this process. The more we manage to digitize, the less people we need. And as for the second thing, I think as we successfully implement this service mapping, we will have a clearer picture of to what extent that can simplify the model, because the lack of service mapping is moving us to have that reporting in the 3 layers, right? The business people trying to measure the business side of the equation in terms of KPIs, the technology people managing the technology KPIs for managing the platforms, and then the vendor management people managing the vendor-related KPIs. So to the extent that we integrate this, that will simplify the model a lot, and I think that's the model that we have.
Right. What about Josue? Michael, what about you from your perspective?
So when I take a look at some of the maturation of the VM, we do a lot of the good things that Jose is doing as well, but we do it at our segment level. So we start looking at that maturation scale, but we actually try very hard not to paint it with a brush and say, okay, we want to be at level 5 for all of these capabilities. The reality is that is probably very difficult to attain, and there's all kinds of dependencies around systems, processes, and such. So what we try to do are actively doing right now is trying to say, what is the maturation level we want to get in each of those disciplines? So when you look at performance, when you look at vendor relationships, maybe we want to have a stronger capability in one, so we don't say across the board, we're going to 5. I don't think that's realistic, nor do I think it's attainable. I think, though, you can, in your maturation process, be selective and say where you need to focus, aligning to your business plans and your technology plans. You can be very successful and say, we're going to mature our vendor relationship capabilities to support innovation, to support new vendors, to support new thought processes and technology. And we're going to focus here in this area and tie it back to the segment. And I think that's where we can not only mature our processes, but we can also add benefit to our organization in terms of supporting those roadmaps, which are critical, because we do have multi-year plans, 10-year plans to execute. And the expectation is clear that we put the foundation in to do it. And I think that's the best way to do it.
I agree 100%. I agree 100%. And I think that it is as everything continues to change and technology continues to evolve, but the organization continue to be able to be more dynamic and collaborate more with the business. And again, and during COVID-19, to be able to accelerate and be an enabler, working together with the vendors to continue to push the digital shift, right? Especially on accelerating the business, the digital business initiatives that are, for the most part, taking a large portion of a lot of the services that our vendors are being delivering for us. But as I want to wrap up, and I would like to allow each of you a couple of minutes to give us your main takeaways from today's conversation and something for the audience to think about going forward. Josue, I will start with you.
Thank you, Carlos. So I think I will reinforce the need of considering this a journey towards excellence. And in that journey, you need to develop strong relationships with the key decision makers and the subject matter experts along your organization, to develop a strong mechanism to connect the front with the back in order for you to have better leverage to adjust in order to react to what the business is demanding. I think that's the challenge that we have in Siemens. I think we all share the same challenge, right? And to one extent or another, as long as we consider that we will never achieve that end, this is a continuum, we will always continue to be improving.
Thanks, Josue. Michael, your closing remarks?
No, I would echo the same comments that he put forward. I think they're great. I think a couple of things I would add to it is the fundamentals are still something you should stick to because they are your basis of your decision making. So good data and good understanding of where your spend and everything is going to be critical in your success, and it'll help you start to develop that journey and the roadmap to get there. I think that's very important. Recognize technology is evolving and it can help you on that journey. So as you start to look at what's coming down the pipe as a parting word, as you create your organization's journey, and I hate to say it, there is not one size fits all. There is no perfect solution that's going to come in and work for everybody because it doesn't happen. But as you look at your technology, make sure it's complementary to your business strategy and your technology strategy, because that's where the real value is going to show up. Because making it yours is going to give people the answers to be how to do things, how to innovate, how to move forward, how to get better at doing things. If you come in with a one-stop solution, I think what's going to happen and a way of doing things, you're going to lose track of what's important. And at the end of the day, it's always the fundamentals.
Right.
What value do you bring?
Right. Thanks, Michael. And with this, I want to thank Jose and Michael for your participation, your great leadership. You guys are tremendous leaders, and you guys are doing a great job in each of your organizations. And I thank you for participating. And I thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. I know that we have a lot of clients and vendors that are with us today. So hopefully there was just great value as part of this good conversation. Adriana?
Carlos, if we could do 1 minute of your key takeaways, that would be great.
So, I think that, as we've talked about, from the overall, vendor governance and how everything is evolving, and, with technology platforms, the cloud, and the complex ecosystem of partnerships in the digital enterprise, I think that being able to leverage technology effectively, being able to align properly with the business processes in a simplified fashion. I think that the key takeaway and what we're seeing with our clients is simplification. Less is more, being able to leverage the right technologies in a coordinated fashion to maintain the integrity of the data, to be able to effectively report what matters to the business from the business value perspective, and being able to very rapidly adjust to the changes, to drive innovation, to be able to be part of that leadership team that is helping make those decisions in an agile fashion, and being able to have that dynamic governance going on an ongoing basis. I think that is where things are moving. I think that what we heard from Michael and Josue is really some of the steps that are part of that journey that is going to get us there. So this is how we're moving into the next generation of digital governance. And I hope that as we go through this process and we see the vendors making some of the adjustments in the delivery teams and how they become more strategic partners with their clients, we can have a more integrated and dynamic way on executing and driving innovation in the different organizations. So I think that, that is, from the Avasant perspective, how we're seeing digital governance evolve and going to the next level.
Thank you, Carlos. And thank you to our panelists for the fantastic conversation today. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. We will be hosting quite a few more digital forums this year. We hope to see you again soon. A replay of today's session, as well as the slides Carlos shared, will be emailed to all attendees, as well as available on our events page shortly. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.